When I first received the invitation from the Office of the Chief Rabbi of South Africa to participate in Sane and Daba, I was very grateful and also very impressed that the Chief Rabbi's office had the courage to include a topic so sensitive as human sexuality in their program. From my own experience in Israel and in other places in the world, I know that this is not always a simple decision to make. And I look forward to the fact that perhaps this discussion can initiate further dialogue among the members of this community with regard to a topic that is so critical and so important. The other point I just want to sort of begin with is that, as you see, this is not exactly where I had intended to begin to speak with you. Unfortunately, a few days ago, I fell and broke some bones in my hip and my finger, and ended up here in the Port Elizabeth Hospital, where I will be for a while. And again, the Chief Rabbi's office has been extremely flexible in allowing me to give this talk, despite the fact that this is not necessarily the ideal condition. I have a PowerPoint presentation which accompanies this, and it's not going to necessarily be quite as smooth as I anticipated because just of the circumstances, so I ask you to bear with me. Also, we will not necessarily have the opportunity here to have any kind of dialogue, to get any questions or responses from you, so I encourage all of you who may be listening to this talk to be in touch with me at any point that you want to. As you can see on the PowerPoint, you have my email address on there, and you're welcome to be in touch with me at any time that you wish. So let's start with this. If we assume that creation is in some level a divine act, then a gift from God is the fact that we can all enjoy physical touch, and even on a more intense level, we can all enjoy sexual pleasure. This means that this is not something that's strange from us, not something that is different from us, not something that is separate from us, something that is inherently part of us. And our question that we will be dealing with here is, how do we make that part of our community, particularly as those who are observing, or as our observing Jews? We have never denied the centrality of passion and intimacy. We've never denied its power. What we need to be able to do is figure out how to make this an integral part of our lives. Where is the place of human sexuality in a Jewish committed life? And is there a golden mean that essentially somehow allows us to avoid any extremes? And let me give you two examples of what those extremes may look like. I once had a woman come to me and say, "Dr. Ribner, I do not want God in my bedroom," meaning I'm willing to be an observant woman, but anything with regard to Jewish religion that has to do with the intimate life that I share with my husband, I do not want to hear that at all in my bedroom. And I think that is one extreme, in fact, that many people do have, and many people have as an aspect of the way they confront human sexuality. The other extreme is an incident that I had with regard to two young people, a young couple who came to see me, an ultra-religious couple, and a lovely young couple, very committed to each other, very much comfortable with each other, no particular difficulties with regard to any kind of sexual dysfunctions, but somehow or other, their sex life just was not working for them. And as much as I asked my intake questions and tried to determine exactly what the problem was, it became extremely difficult to try to conceptualize where I could possibly help them. Until finally I asked them, I said, "Tell me, describe your room to me, describe your bedroom to me." And they said, "Well, we have very lovely curtains, we have bedspreads, we have bookcases." I said, "Well, do you have any pictures on your wall?" And they said, "Oh, yes, we do. We have pictures of famous rabbis." I said, "Do me a favor, take the rabbis, take them out of your bedroom and put them in any other room in your house." And I think that really reflects the kind of conflict that people may have with regard to this kind of situation. Meaning, is it possible, even in the intensity of a sexual relationship, to somehow have a religious ideal, some kind of religious philosophy inherent in that? And let me read an initial quote to you, which I think sort of puts this in some kind of perspective. However, Aaron Lichtenstein was a Talmudic scholar who passed away very recently and who represented really an ideal for many people in the contemporary Orthodox Jewish community. And one of the papers that he wrote, which is significantly from a historical perspective, is something called Of Marriage, Relationship, and Relations. And let me read you a quote from that particular document. He says, Rabbi Lichtenstein, "We assert the value of romantic love, its physical manifestation included, without flinching from the prospect of concomitant sensual pleasure." In other words, romantic love is something that we accept as a norm, and we include with that, without any question, sensual pleasure. And he continues, "And we do so without harboring guilt or reservations." And here is the sentence I think is going to be which guides us through this discussion today. We insist, of course, upon its sanctification, meaning if we assume that physical intimacy is in fact an integral part of our lives, how do we give it some level of sanctity? How do we make it a sanctified aspect of our lives? And this is essentially the challenge that we will be dealing with. Traditional Jewish sources have always been replete with sexual references. And it's important that we begin with those sources because essentially on those will we be able to build the kind of philosophical perspective, the kind of practical perspective, which may in fact be of great help to us. So we're going to look at some traditional Jewish sources. And of course you know that in the 5 books of Moses, we don't hesitate at all from discussing various aspects of sexual relations that people have with each other, some more acceptable, some not acceptable. But let's take a look at another one at this point that really gives a better sense, I think, of the spirituality, the sensuality of what human sexuality could be. This is, of course, from Shir HaShirim, from the Song of Songs. And what you're reading here and what you're hearing from me are expressions from a wife to her husband. And this is what she says. "Like threads of scarlet are your lips. Your mouth is lovely. Like a segment of pomegranate are your cheeks and your hair. Let my beloved enter his garden and eat its choicest fruits. My beloved is fair and flushed, distinguished among the multitudes. His head is the finest gold. His hair is curled raven black. His eyes are like doves by the watercourses, washed with milk, set in fullness. His cheeks are like a perfumed bed, like banks of fragrant flowers. His lips are like lilies, dripping with flowing myrrh." Now, I don't know about you men out there, not too often that my wife describes me with those terms, but certainly we're seeing here what could be a replication of what should be the kind of feeling that perhaps a woman has for the love of her life. And whether or not one accepts the notion that this is purely metaphoric and that it describes the nature of the relationship between God and Israel, nevertheless, we are using language here which is highly sensual. And because it is highly sensual, it is behooving to us to begin to understand that this is a part of our heritage that is basic and that really celebrates the notion of physical intimacy. Let's move for a moment from the Bible to several Talmudic examples. And this first one is from a Gemara in the Babylonian Talmud of Yoma. During the times when the Ark, the Holy Ark, was in the temple in Jerusalem, it was generally covered. And on top of the Ark, in addition to having inside of it the 10 Commandments, the top of the Ark held the cheruvim. We don't exactly know what they are, but our assumption is that the cheruvim were sort of formations of angels. And listen to this particular verse from one of the rabbis of the Talmud. Rav Katina said, "Whenever Israel came up to the festivals, the curtain of the ark would be removed for them, and the cheruvim were shown to them. People would come up for the 3 festivals of Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot, and at that time the curtain was taken away and people could see the ark. And they saw as follows. The bodies were intertwined with one another of the cheruvim, and they would be thus addressed. This is what the rabbis would tell the people who came to see these cheruvim. Look, they said, you are beloved before God, as the love between man and woman. In other words, the example that's used with regard to the love between God and the children of Israel is the example of the love between a man and a woman. Moving on to the Talmud in Brachot, we have the following. And again, this requires a little bit of explanation. Rav Kahana was one of the great lights of the Talmudic world, and he was a student of Rav. Rav being sort of one of those Talmudic sages who was considered to be a source of the Masorah tradition by everyone. So it happened at one time that Rav Kahana went in and hid under Rav's bed. He heard him chatting with his wife, right? Rav Kahana heard Rav chatting with his wife and joking and doing what he was required to do. Namely, he was doing what men and women do in bed. He was being intimate with his wife. Now, apparently, Rav Kahana was so overcome by this experience that he was not able to keep himself silent, and he said as follows. One would think, he said, that Abba meaning Rav, Abba's a father, Rav meaning his Talmudic father, had never sipped the dish before. Rav Kahana said, my teacher, Rav, is so enthusiastic about his intimate relationship with his wife, it's as if he'd done it just for the first time. Well, Kahana heard him and said, are you there? He says to Rav, are you under my bed? And he says, go out, because it is not the way of the world. Rav says to Kahana, what are you doing under my bed? That's not the way you're supposed to be conducting yourself. To which Rav Kahana replied, it is a matter of Torah, and I am required to learn. That even in this relationship between a Talmud Chacham, a wise man, and his Talmud and his student, the notion of learning what intimacy is all about was considered to be an integral aspect of their responsibility. At this point, Rav counsels him and says, this is not the right way to do it, but the notion of needing to learn this is certainly an aspect of what should be part of Jewish tradition. And finally, one other. Okay, I'm going to ask you just to take a focus on the left-hand side of this page before you look at the right-hand side. The left-hand side is from the Talmud in the Masechet Shabbat. And it says as follows. When in the course of cohabitation, the husbands will hold your pearl in one hand and the kiln in one hand, you, however, should offer them the pearl, but the kiln you should not offer them until you are tormented, and only then should you offer it to them. Now, those of you who've had any experience learning Chumash or learning Talmud know that Rashi was one of the primary commentators on our text, and without Rashi, we really would have very little knowledge of what some of the more esoteric texts seem to mean. Rashi lived during the time of the Crusades. He lived in France, and Rashi had only daughters. And Rashi explained this particular piece of the Talmud as follows. When your husband caresses you to arouse your desire for intercourse and holds the breasts with one hand, and that place meaning the genital area, with the other, give the breasts at first to increase his passion, and do not give him the place of intercourse too soon until his passion increases and he is in pain with desire. Okay, I'm going to give you all a minute to calm down from that for a moment. As you can see from this, the Talmud did not hesitate in any way from assuming that anything that had to do with normative sexual interaction between a husband and wife was seen to be the subject of discourse. In other words, we did not hide from this, we did not flee from this, we did not assume, as I think many other religions did, that religion somehow was contradictory to having a normative kind of intense, personal, impassioned sexual life. And here we have examples from the Talmud itself that give us that very clear message. Our problem is that regrettably there is a common perception. And that perception is that religion only tries to limit sexuality. And in fact, is it true that the Jewish religion is no different? Well, yes and no. Many religions, in fact, have made efforts to find some kind of common ground between that particular religion's ethos and the notions of the power and potential for passion and compassion of human sexuality. For example, this first book that you see here on this slide is a Christian example of how they are making an attempt to, in fact, bridge that gap. The next one is a Muslim attempt to, in fact, do the same. And finally, the third one is a Jewish attempt to do the same. You'll notice this book is co-written by me, David Ribner. This is the Newlywed's Guide to Physical Intimacy, which is a book that my co-author and I wrote about 5 or 6 years ago, which is an introduction to human sexuality for young religious couples, very clear, very explicit, very much pro-sexuality, and very much underscoring the notion that human sexuality is, in fact, a clear aspect of our lives. However, we do have boundaries, and there is no question that those boundaries are, in fact, the place in which we need to continue to explore this kind of duality between human sexuality and between religion. And let me give you some examples of that. First of all, this is really the classic picture. Notice we have here a young bride and groom coming out from under the chuppah. This will be the time in their lives when they begin to have sexual contact with each other, physical intimacy. We assume that before this, they will have had the opportunity to create emotional intimacy between the two of them, but the notion of physical intimacy waits until they leave the chuppah. They are now married, and this is the context in which this kind of interaction is supposed to begin to build itself and essentially infuse their lives. So what we will be looking now at is sexuality and its sanctification in this context. In other words, how do we sanctify sexuality in the context of a married couple? That is what our task is going to be at this point. And the truth is that as observant Jews, as people who are committed on some level to tradition, we are charged with sanctifying the world. As our job is to take the world from where it is right now and every aspect that we make use of this world to raise it on some level so that it's a higher, more sanctified piece of the creation. And a classic example of it is, of course, is blessings we make before we eat something. If I take an apple and I make the blessing about before I eat this apple, the point of this blessing is to say that this very much of a human activity, almost an animalistic activity of eating, is not just eating. It takes into consideration that God is present in the universe, and that as I do eat this apple, I have a sense of sanctifying this act. So our challenge is, how do we make that something that is part of human sexuality? And the truth is that there are essentially two perspectives for us to take a look at this point and see whether or not we can find some place that's in the middle. One perspective says to us that sex is inherently profane and that therefore it must always be sanctified. It is never a neutral experience, and therefore holiness must be brought into the experience itself. In other words, anytime there is a manifestation of sexuality within a marital relationship, it is our obligation to somehow sanctify that in a way that we will be consciously aware of those two kinds of experiences in our lives. And let me give you one example of that. Rav Elimelech Milizhensk, for those of you who may have some sense of the Hasidic world, was known as one of the stellar initiators of the entire Hasidic philosophy. And much of what we do, much of what we say within the Hasidic world stems from those things which he shared with us. However, in the world of human sexuality, Rav Elimelech Milizhensk took a somewhat extreme position. And this is what he had to say. The way of the truly righteous person is that he have no improper thoughts or desire, even for his wife. And even when he needs to be with his wife intimately, he must then think of the higher spheres and try to not be aware at all that he is with his wife. In other words, for Rav Elimelech, the notion of any kind of physical pleasure with regard to human sexuality was an anathema. Essentially, he is saying to us, even though you may need to be with your spouse at times, perhaps only for the sense of procreation, at those moments you should, much as possible, try to have your thoughts, your feelings fixed on the higher spheres, and you should not be experiencing any kind of physical pleasure at all. I must say sort of parenthetically here that as a sex therapist, I'm not so sure how that is physically possible to do. Not being able to think of some sort of passionate thought, experiencing passionate feelings during the time one is with one's spouse, and being able to function sexually seems to be perhaps something only available on the level of someone like Rabbi Elimelech. I believe for the most of us that doesn't necessarily end up being a positively potential experience. In other words, even during sexual intercourse, proper thoughts at all times. And whatever behavioral consequences may ensue, nevertheless, it is those proper thoughts which need to be part of who we are as committed Jews. The other possibility here, and another perspective, and what I believe is more of the mainstream perspective within religious Judaism, is that holiness is the result of perfecting of a relationship. That is, I don't need to bring holiness, thoughts of sanctity into my relationship. I need to do my best to make this relationship the most positive I possibly can, and then sanctity will accrue. In other words, God's blessing rests on the mutuality of a relationship, on respect, on compassion, on empowerment, on shared pleasure. The goal of intimacy, from a traditional Jewish perspective, is a focus on each other, on being engulfed by a sense of completeness. One other quotation, I think, which may give some sense of this, comes from a contemporary philosopher with regard to notions of Jewish ideals, called Kravitz, and he says as follows: constructing a healthy sexual ethic requires knowledge on the level of the mind. In other words, first of all, I need to have awareness. I need to, in contemporary terms, a sense of mindfulness of what's going on at the moment, not ignoring the immediacy of who I am and who I am with. Secondly, honesty on the level of the heart. That the emotions here must be true emotions. The emotions must be fixed on my partner and not on anyone else. That these emotions must be one that we can verbalize, that we can share, that not only is our interaction going to be physical, it's going to be verbal, emotional, psychological, and perhaps on some place in our lives, spiritual as well. And finally, close spiritual attention to the way in which ethics develop and how they function in your life. In other words, we also want to make sure that we conduct ourselves in an ethical manner. We conduct ourselves in accordance with the values of our community, our family, our religion, and all of those put together end up giving us the kind of context in which a truly compassionate sexual relationship can occur. I want to give you two other examples from Talmudic quotations in which the same metaphor is used, but used in different ways and gives very different messages. The first one is from the Babylonian Talmud of Brachot, and it says as follows: Torah scholars should not be with their wives like roosters. Now, the implication here is that roosters are engaged sexually with their partners constantly, and Torah scholars should not make this a constant part of their lives. How often this particular passage does not tell us, but not on a daily basis. But interestingly enough, in the Jerusalem Talmud, we have a similar metaphor. Rabbi Yaakov ben Avon said, "The people of Israel should not act like these roosters who have sexual relations rising and then descending to eat." In other words, sexuality cannot just be a physical act. It doesn't mean that you are engaged with some kind of sexual experience with your partner, get out of bed and go get a beer. It means that you need to continue to have this kind of relationship, not just on a physical level, but on an emotional level as well. And that is essentially what the Torah is telling us with regard to the ideal of sexual relations. It's interesting that from the very beginning in biblical texts, the metaphor for sexual relations is knowing, is yeda. And there are many other words in Hebrew that could be used as metaphors for human sexuality. Shchiva, be'ila, all of those convey the same kind of message. But somehow or other, we use this term, and it's important to, I think, get a sense of what is the underlying meaning. The first place this is used is early on in the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, and it says, V'ha'adam yada et Chava ishto. Adam knew Chava, his wife. Okay? What does this knowing mean? How do we understand this knowing? The Netziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was one of the primary biblical exegetes of the previous generation, explains this in a beautiful manner. He says as follows: "It is worthwhile knowing that every place where the language of knowing is written regarding sexual intercourse, its meaning is that he recognizes and knows with whom he will have relations, that it is this specific woman and no other. And this is the exact meaning of knowing Chava, his wife, because she is his wife, and not because she is a female of the human race, because she is special to him and to him alone." So in our use of the term knowing each other, and occasionally we find it to be somewhat a focus of our joking, the notion of using the word knowing, but knowing in a biblical sense here is far beyond the act of physical intercourse. It's actually investing in knowing another human being, and that is the relationship that we should be looking for. I want to read you now two other excerpts. I'll tell you at the end where they are from, but I think they incorporate here essentially the messages that I feel to be so important and should so be the source of, I hope, further conversation among those of you who are attending this session today. In how we behave, how we learn, how we work, how we eat, how we pray, and yes, how we make love, we affirm our values and beliefs. The core values and behavioral expectations that guide our day-to-day interactions have equal application in the bedroom. Making space for others in our lives, respecting boundaries, sensitivity, supporting each other's individuality, and seeking to develop together are all qualities which enhance a couple's sex life as much as they enhance our communal and familial fabric. Additionally, a successful sex life requires a sense of freedom from the outside world and from the invasiveness of others, as well-meaning as these individuals and their pronouncements may be. It is, in fact, the absence of this sense of freedom which contributes to some sexual dysfunctions. As a member of the Jewish community, one can be committed to tradition and be sexual without disconnecting from either. And let me end this with two quotations from Hasidic masters who had much profound to say about this. The first is from Rav Baruch of Kosov, and he says as follows: I once heard a modest man bemoan the fact that it is human nature to have physical pleasure from sex. He preferred that there be no feeling of pleasure at all, so that he could have sex solely to fulfill the command of his Creator. And I thought that way myself. Later, however, God favored me with the gift of grace, granting me understanding of the true meaning of sanctification during sexual intercourse, that it comes precisely from feeling physical pleasure. This secret is wondrous, deep, and awesome. And finally, Rav Tzvi Hirsch Zitikovich taught his disciples that, quote, before sexual intercourse, they should give thanks to God in their spoken language for the pleasure that He created. And that essentially is my blessing to all of you. May your sexual life with your partners be so much an expression of that which is wondrous, deep, and awesome, that all you will find yourself doing is thanking God for the pleasure that He has created. My friends, thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope that this has been something that is worthwhile for you to be able to continue discussing each other for a significant amount of time. I'm available to you by email, as I mentioned, and in a few short months, I hope you'll be able to find a book that's coming out soon called Ani L'Dodi, I Am For My Beloved, a married couple's guide to enhance intimacy, which I am writing with my friend Tali Rosenbaum, which is a volume for couples which have had some sexual experience, seek to enhance that, and do so in the context of the sanctity of their religious lives. Thank you to all of you.